Ahead and introduce all of our panelists. And I'll start with Mark. So Mark is the founder and president of Convention of States Foundation and Convention of States Action. Convention of States Action has over 5 million supporters and activists representing every state legislative district in the nation. Mark appears regularly on television, radio, and online discussing conservative grassroots perspectives on local issues. And as the new updated bio I got also says that Mark is the new CEO at Parler. So we're going to ask him some questions about that because that should be interesting. We also have Dr. Casey Burgett. Casey is the director of the Legislative Affairs program at the Graduate School of Political Management at the George Washington University. Prior to joining the Graduate School of Political Management, Dr. Burgett was a senior governance fellow at the R Street Institute, where his research focused on issues of congressional capacity and reform. In this role, Casey wrote regularly for both scholarly and journalistic publications, including CNN, The Washington Post, Politico, and appeared on a variety of television and radio outlets. Scott Tillman is the National Field Director with U.S. Term Limits. For more than a decade, Scott has worked outside the system to bring real reform to local and state government. With 13 years of grassroots experience, Scott has a proven record of accomplishment identifying and training local leaders and supporting them to effect real change in government policy. Specializing in petition drives, Scott has successfully led and advised local and state activist organizations through the initiative and referendum process. And Scott has served as the National Field Director for the Liberty Initiative Fund, a regional manager with the Illinois Policy Institute, and an alliance manager with the Sam Adams Alliance. Scott has directed petition and earned media campaigns in more than a dozen states. So thank you guys all for joining us today. We really appreciate it. Want to turn it over to Mark. I really just want to go a little more into you guys' background and just have you kind of introduce yourself to the group and tell us a little bit more about the work that you're doing before we jump into the meat of the discussion.
Sure. Thanks for having me. Sorry, I was a couple of minutes late, technical trouble here. So I am Mark Meckler, and I am the president of Convention of States Foundation and Convention of States Action, related C3 and C4. My background is I'm actually an attorney by training, first 10 years of practice in business and real estate, and then the second 10 years in internet law. As the internet came of age, I came of age with it as a lawyer. In 2009, I got sort of dragged into politics via the Tea Party movement. I helped to found Tea Party Patriots, which grew to be the largest Tea Party organization in the nation. I left that in 12 because I felt like it wasn't having an impact. And even after the 2010 election, we'd elected this wave class, and then nothing changed in Washington, D.C. So I was actually going to leave politics. I had a friend and donor who told me you can't leave politics. We had a little argument about that, and he won. And I founded Citizens for Self-Governance. And the goal was just to return government to the people. That's why Citizens for Self-Governance. We didn't even really know what that meant. The first project was raising $1 million to give to grassroots groups all over the country. They hadn't got much money during the Tea Party movement. Unbelievably, we'd raised many millions, but very little of it trickled down to the actual grassroots. So that was part of it, was to get back to where I came from. The second project was suing the IRS, believe it or not. So when the IRS attacked all the Tea Party groups, I was really frustrated because I saw the TV lawyers talking about how bad it was that the IRS was attacking the Tea Party groups and nobody was suing. And so I ended up finding a law firm out of Kansas City that I've used quite a bit on stuff, and they're real reasonable guys and they're not afraid of the federal government. So we funded that lawsuit. Ultimately, that class action lawsuit 4.5 years later resulted in a $3.75 million settlement in favor of the plaintiff's class. And so that was kind of getting my teeth cut on really fighting directly against the government outside of the electoral system. And then we founded the Convention of States Project. That was brought to me by another guy, probably a lot of you guys know, Mike Ferris. Mike Ferris is the founder of the homeschool movement in America. If you're homeschooled, you have kids or family that are homeschooled, you got to thank Mike Ferris for that. In the 70s, when homeschooling was illegal all over the country, he was the guy that got into the fight and made it legal, which was really an impossible fight to do that in all 50 states. But today we take it for granted. Back then, it wasn't so easy. So Mike said to me that we have a problem with our system of governance, that it's not about who we elect. It's not a personnel problem. It's a structure problem. And kind of delved into it. And he said, the only way we're going to fix this is by fixing the structure that we've broken. And the only way to do that is to use a tool the founders gave us in Article 5, which is the states can get together in a convention and propose amendments to restrain federal tyranny, term limits among them, to bring power back away from the federal government and bring it back to the people and the states. And so that's how Convention of States was founded. That was 7.5 years ago. There was nobody involved, me and my wife and a couple other people and Mike Ferris. Today, there are over 5 million people are involved in the movement. They're in every single state legislative district in the country. We have 49 states where the resolution's been introduced. It's been passed out of committee in one house and the other in 30. It's been passed in one house or the other completely in 23. And today, 15 states are on the books as having called for convention. This year, I expect we'll pass between 5 and 10 more states.
Awesome. Great. Thank you. Thank you. Scott, Casey, whoever wants to go next.
My name is Scott Tillman. I'm the National Field Director with Liberty Initiative, the U.S. Term Limits and Liberty Initiative Fund. One Liberty Initiative Fund, we help people with the initiative and referendum process. U.S. Term Limits, we're working to amend the U.S. Constitution for term limits. And we're actually working on 2 different routes to do that. One, we're working on pledges to actually get the resolution passed through U.S. Congress. The other route is the route that Mark mentioned when he was talking, where you actually go through state by state and have states call for a resolution or a call for a convention that would address a certain amendment. And the amendment we're pursuing, of course, is term limits on Congress. So we've been working on that for several years. Back in 1995, we had a lot of momentum. A lot of states had term limited their own congressional delegations, but there was a Supreme Court case, U.S. Term Limits versus Thornton, a 5-4 decision threw that out and said that only a constitutional amendment would suffice to have term limits put on members, so it would be equal across the board. And we've been pursuing different options since then, pledges, and now the Article 5 route. So we are picking up momentum with the Article 5 route, as well as picking up momentum with our pledge program.
Awesome. Thank you.
Very good. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Casey Burgett, and I'm a professor at the George Washington University here in the swampland. So I recognize that I am with potentially unfriendly audiences, but I'm interested to have the conversation today. Term limits is something that I accidentally got into through my work. So I got a PhD in American government and then went to work for Congress's private think tank. It's called the Congressional Research Service, which you've probably never heard of. And that's kind of the point. And a reason why term limits, in my view, are not the panacea, the silver bullet that we think they are. And at CRS, we work for members and their staff answering questions about the impacts of policy proposals from everything under the sun, from financial derivatives to insurance to the environment to gun control, literally everything. Congress doesn't have its own information sources, and that's stretched so thin that they actually reach out to hopefully experts to give them unbiased, nonpartisan, not bipartisan, nonpartisan information sources so that they can become better informed and make more informed decisions. And term limits is one of those things, because I fully recognize how popular these things are. They are not a new reform idea in the slightest. They've been introduced every single Congress since 1949. Sometimes with bigger successes than others. They've been instituted at various state levels. And the results of these things are clear. I recognize the impetus of it. I recognize the frustration with Congress. It is my job in both my academic work and in my real life work to write about things that make the system of government work better. Because I think if anything we can agree on today is the system is broken at a lot of different levels. And there's a lot of reasons for that. And term limits is often thrown out there as one of the best things that we can do to fix all of what ails us. And I would urge us to have a conversation about the specific frustrations we have with our system of government, with our Congress, and then talk about how term limits may not be that one shining feature that we think will fix all of the things that we're frustrated with. So excited for the conversation. Appreciate you guys for having me and look forward to this.
Thank you. Thank you, guys. Appreciate it. I guess we can just dive in and kind of, Casey, you started to talk about how it's often seen as a panacea to solve a lot of the problems that we have. Why do you disagree with that, I guess?
The two common features, the two common reasons that are given for why term limits would help us solve this stuff is that it would eliminate career politicians, right? We all have this sense that politicians are in it for themselves. They're out for themselves. The minute they get elected, they go Washington and forget all of the reasons they got into this business in the first place. And Mark, as I was listening to your intro, the fact that you were involved in the early Tea Party and then quickly got frustrated with the lack of impact, the policy impact, is awesome. And if you talk to any of my students, they will be one of the first to tell you that the Tea Party had an incredible impact, both legislatively, the discussion that they brought to bear about what we expect of our government, The bombs that they threw in a lot of legislative proposals, and this kind of gets to the point, is that we only see outcomes. What we're really bad about is seeing processes. And the Tea Party was one of the most effective groups in the last 3 decades about changing the processes about how we get these outcomes. So it's awesome to see that you can still be frustrated at even supporting some of the most effective lawmakers that we've had, who many of whom have since moved on. So it eliminates these career politicians, right? That we would increase the diversity of who can serve us, that then we could return to this citizen legislature that we think that there was this perfect time of which this operated in, which there wasn't. If you study history, these were never citizen legislatures ever. These were usually old, rich white dudes. And that's been historically true too. And then the second main argument is that it would decrease reliance on the swampy interests, right? Big money donors, special interest groups who always come with a partisan agenda. And if we only had term limits, that we wouldn't have politicians so reliant on these folks to make decisions that affect us all. Both those things just simply aren't true. They haven't been supported by the data. They definitely aren't supported by the fact that we are already reliant on these folks because of the structural problems that Mark referenced, though they are different structural problems than he might think they are or be imagining. They just won't solve these two problems. And what they will do is probably exacerbate them. You will get more reliant on these same folks that you're already pissed off at because you're going to be replacing the members themselves that are elected to do the job that is just simply very, very hard to do. There's no school for this. There's no school for Congress. There's no way to become an efficient lawmaker, an experienced lawmaker on day one. You're elected on a Tuesday, and a couple months later, you're responsible for a $1.5 trillion budget with no idea about how the processes work and how the government actually functions in a way that is successful. And I guess I'll stop there just to say that those two reasons that folks often give simply aren't supported by the data or even what we see on a day-to-day basis here in DC.
Scott, I see you unmuted. You can take it away. And we're getting questions already, so I can tell the audience is pretty interested in this. But go ahead, Scott.
When it comes to fixing our government, there is no silver bullet. This isn't a werewolf movie, and there's not a silver bullet. But we know that we do want fair elections in our country. And to have fair elections, we need to solve a few issues. We need to solve the advantage of incumbency. We need to solve the issue of money in politics, and we need to solve the issue of gerrymandering. Term limits deals with the advantage of incumbency. And to deny that there's an advantage of incumbency, somebody must really have their head in the sand. It's very, very obvious. Name recognition, media coverage, fundraising. It's very discouraging to opponents who try to run against an incumbent, because the incumbent can go and ask everybody who's got pending legislation for donations, and those people will donate to that person, and they won't donate to the challenger because you've got pending legislation in front of this person that you have an interest in. They also have the ability to frank, and they know how to use the system. Do we consider the ability to win an election something that is, a great qualifier for, holding public office? There are lots of different things. Nobody's claiming that term limits are a silver bullet, but one thing they do is they solve the issue of incumbent advantage. Other things that they do, term limits increase voter turnout. More candidates out there going door to door, doing candidate things, get more people to the ballot box. So there's this idea that if we just had an informed electorate, we wouldn't need term limits and Congress would be so much better. Well, give us term limits and we're going to get more of an informed electorate, because they're going to be communicating with people who are running for those offices. Term limits is not going to stop money from trying to influence Washington, D.C. But at the same point, we know that donor profiles change over time. The first time somebody runs for office, they put in a huge chunk of their own money. They get a lot of money from their mom and their friends and their family, the friends and family money. Then after the primary or after the general, when it's decided, you'll see all this lobbyist special interest money pour in to shore up. The next time they run, the second time they're running, when they're running for re-election, if they're putting in their own money, they've got a serious problem. For the most part, their own money has disappeared. The money that's coming in is still some friends and family, but an overwhelming amount of special interest money. The third time they run, the friends and family money as a percentage of what they're raising goes down even more. And the funding is made up in greater amount by special interests, mostly from the capital. If it's in, a state like Michigan, the Michigan Capital Beltway, the special interest, but in Washington, we've got national and international interests that are constantly there looking for their handouts. Over time, those interests start to donate more, and the local interests to that district donate less. Term limits cause lobbyists to lose power. Lobbyist power is based on their relationships with legislators, and it's hard for them with term limits to reestablish relationships. Jack Abramoff, who was a lobbyist who went to prison, he said, a legislator that had been bought and paid for was worth his weight in gold with the return you'd get on them. When we have term limits on the ballot in the states and in the cities, you see clearly the chambers, the unions, they all line up to oppose term limits because term limits stop the lobbyist power. The other thing that's claimed is that term limits, when legislators leave, they're just going to move into lobbyist jobs. But right now we have a lot of legislators who leave Washington, D.C. and then do go to lobbyist jobs, and their value is very high because there are so few of them that do. In the state of Michigan, we have a flooded market. We have the strictest term limits in the nation, the best term limits in the nation, and we have flooded the market. So people who go to be lobbyists when they leave office in Michigan have a very short shelf life. And then you have the situation where when you leave, you automatically don't know nearly as many people as you would if you left Washington, D.C., where there's very low turnover. And it's like going back to the homecoming game. When you're, first year out of high school and you go back to the homecoming game, a lot of people. Second year back, a lot fewer people. And the third year, when you go back and you try to go to the parties after the homecoming game, they're like, who's this creepy old guy who's trying to come to the high school party? Same thing when legislators leave office and try to be lobbyists. Their shelf life goes way down, and the lobbying firms don't like that. They want to have people who have established relationships that they can depend on to get things passed.
Great, thank you, Mark. You can take it away if you want to chime in on this question as well.
Yeah, look, I come down somewhere in the middle, so which is, I guess, what the role I'm supposed to play here anyway. But it is really where I come down. So I don't think term limits solve a lot. I think if we go out, like the thing that I'm most interested in is the bloating and the spending and the size and scope of state governments. And I think all the studies show that we've got all these states with term limits. It had no positive effect on the size, scope, and spending of state government. So there was a problem that was trying to be addressed by term limits, as so often the case when we try to address a problem, it doesn't necessarily work. And sometimes we break other things. An example of other things that get broken is if you have legislators that turn over too regularly, they don't have the institutional knowledge, as Casey was saying, but importantly, who does? The lobbyists do, and the bureaucrats do. In California, I've actually sat in meetings with bureaucrats and legislators and had the bureaucrats laugh at the legislators trying to get them to do stuff, saying, look, you're going to be gone in a couple of years. I've been here 10, I'll be here another 10. So I'll just wait you out. And they literally can do this. So I think oftentimes term limits can empower the very classes of people that we're so frustrated about, those who are unelected and unaccountable. The staffers become more and more powerful. The bureaucrats become more and more powerful. So I think it can work at cross purposes with some of the things we're trying to do. I want to push back a little bit on something Casey said about, you don't understand that the Tea Party had this effect on process. To be blunt, I don't care. We don't care about process. As citizens who are trying to reform government, we care about outcomes. We don't need to see how the sausage is made. I don't need to see how people debate. I don't care whether they do things in regular order or not regular order, to the extent that it does not affect outcome. And we didn't see an effect on outcome. They didn't do the things that we sent them to do. The spending increased. It continues to increase, whether it's Republican or Democrat. The spending blows out, the regulations, things just get bigger and bigger. And so that's what I'm looking to do, is to affect the actual outcome. And I question whether term limits do it and whether they have potential negative side effects. My big caveat on all of this, because I am pushing for term limits at the federal level, it's not so much that I support term limits, it's that I support the American people. Roughly 80 to 85% of Americans polled consistently over the last 30 years are in favor of term limits, specifically for Congress. And so my opinion is the American people should get into convention and have that debate on a national scale, and have that debate in a place where they actually can have an effect, where actually maybe we could propose a real term limits amendment. With all due respect, Congress is never going to propose a term limits amendment for itself. You can get all the pledges you want. You're never even going to get a committee vote on it. You're never going to get a floor vote on it. You can have, I know what you're shooting, you get Republicans in both houses support this. It's never coming out of Congress. You'll never get a 2/3 vote out of both houses of Congress because it's against human nature. Human beings like power. And when they get power, they think they're particularly good at exercising that power. And when they're exercising that power, they want to keep exercising that power. So some kind of term limits pledge, in my opinion, that's a waste. And then the last piece of this puzzle is, if we're going to try to impose term limits on the federal government, I said it could potentially cause problems with staffers and bureaucrats. By the way, you can term limit those people if you want. And that's why our resolution is different than US term limits, which is proposing term limits on Congress only, which I think causes and exacerbates problems. If you could term limit Congress, staffers, and bureaucrats and create a consistent and constant turnover in Washington, D.C., I think we might be a lot better off.
So I definitely want to kind of sit there for a second, and I want to ask Scott about that, because that was precisely one of the questions one of our attendees, Dustin Matoka, sent in, which was, what about this idea of turnover of institutional knowledge, and then you have a reliance on these career lobbyists who become quote unquote experts on policy, but also Scott, what are your thoughts on the idea of term limiting government bureaucracies and even government employees? I mean, is that something that you see fitting into this, or where does your group stand on that?
So we are in favor of term limits on all of them. We want to term limit everybody. Right now, the movement is, we're working through our legislative channels and our options on term limiting Congress, but we are interested in term limiting the others too. And one thing you have to keep in mind is there's a lot of patronage, and it's not just people getting jobs in congressional offices because they're connected to a congressman. They're getting jobs in lobbying firms because they're connected to a congressman, and they're getting jobs in congressional offices because they've been in this lobbying firm or in this bureaucracy for a very long time. Yes, in California and in Michigan too, where we have the best term limits in the nation, you do see bureaucrats who will say, we're just going to sit and wait you out. But in Washington, D.C., they don't even say we're going to sit and wait you out. They all get in the boat and row down the stream together, and they're all in it, and they're all patting each other on the back, and they're all lining their pockets, and the cronies are getting rich, and the congressmen are getting rich. And the only way that we can throw any sort of a stick in the system is if you have that person, like the legislator in California, who is trying to push back against the system and trying to push back. I'd much rather have somebody in there trying to push back than have what we have in Washington, D.C. right now, which is broken, where everybody is lining each other's pockets. And the American people are getting very, very frustrated with the things that are going on. We talked about the Tea Party, and people got so excited, and they didn't get the change they wanted. Congress is not responsive. Occupy Wall Street has not got the change they wanted. The Tea Party, all these different groups, they pop up from every few years. There's a big movement, and they're getting more and more frustrated because they are not getting any type of change, because there's this institutional knowledge, which is really institutional inertia in Washington, D.C., where leadership does not want to see anything change. Everybody is getting their way. Everybody is lining their pockets. And the people are kind of locked out of the system, and they know they can wait out the true idealistic people. They got them in a minority, and they're in a position where they can't have a real impact. There's a quote by Milton Friedman that's a really great one on this. A reporter asked him if it would, if he could make one big change to make his dreams come true, would it be either a balanced budget amendment or a flat tax? But Friedman said the most important reform would be term limits, a 6-year limit, because the economic point of view, one of the worst features of our current system is that you have a new tax law every few years. And however bad the tax is, if you didn't change it in 5 years, it would do less harm because people would figure out how to work around it. Why do you keep changing it? Because that is the most effective way for people in Washington to raise money. Lobbyists will pay you to put in loopholes, and they will pay you to take them out. The institutional knowledge that we have now is a horrible, horrible institutional inertia that is driving our country into the dirt, with more debt, more controversy at the top, and Congress less willing to stand up and do things because they know they can kick the can down the road and fundraise on those issues.
So Casey, I'm curious, because Scott mentioned seeing lobbyists lose power, seeing increased voter turnout, and an engaged electorate, an informed electorate. I want to know if you feel that same way, and if you do, I'm guessing you don't think that outweighs the downsides of term limits. Or do you even feel? I guess, do you feel that same way? I want to start there, I guess, and find out if you agree with that. You're muted.
That it drives up turnout?
drives up turnout, creates a more informed electorate, and kind of this idea of decreasing lobbyist power. I mean, I know we spoke a bit about these long-term lobbyists who then become experts, but I just want to know your thoughts on kind of those general topics.
Yeah, I'll take the last part first of decreasing lobbyist power. So there's a few misconceptions with lobbyists, and I think we should be careful about just throwing out broad strokes of everyone's lining their pockets and congressmen and women are getting rich, because that's simply just, you might think of that in terms of campaign cash, but it's not something that it's just going into their bank account like the paper bags of cash that we all think that is going on. So it's important to keep on topic about what we're actually alleging here. And then second, study after study show that if you don't know something, you go and ask someone that you do knows something. Oh, and that's if you don't ask Google first, right? If you don't know something, you go find someone who does. And that's either someone that has been in this position longer, a congressman or woman that you trust, a long-serving staffer who you trust, and more often than not, it's special interest groups, because they have this in-house expertise. They pay a lot of money for it, way more than the private sector or the public sector ever could. And sometimes they are hired for lobby or for special relationships. Absolutely. Those are the better connected members. And that's not a horrible thing too, because relationships in almost all industries matter. And if they're changing votes for someone that is like the corrupt model that we think this is, then this is a member problem. You have a problem with your member. But most of these lobbying shops are staffed with nerds. They're staffed with nerds who know the legislative histories of these things, that understand the unintended consequences, because every single law that you ever pass will come with unintended consequences, term limits among them. And they're trying to give information that admittedly comes with a partisan agenda. And if you don't have that in-house expertise, you go ask someone that your party trusts. And you find a Republican-related special interest group, or you find a Democrat-related special interest group to either give you information, or at most times, the bill themselves. They write bills, they write amendments, which why I disagree with the notion that you don't care about how the sausage is made. Where decisions are made and where information come from matters. And we should care about that as citizens. And if it's behind closed doors, that matters too, which is why we want votes on the record, which is why we want like sunshine laws, which is why we like cameras on, because we want to know who our members are talking to and what they're saying. And that's why process matters. But the notion that lobbyists lose power when term limits come is just the exact opposite of what we find in study after study. Sometimes they will with members that leave the chamber, yes, but when you don't know the answer, you go find someone who does. And they are literally, there's lists of them provided to member offices by topic issue of these are the special interest groups that know these things. When you want a talking point, when you want an amendment, these are who we call. This is frustrating. In terms of civic engagement and the fact that this will lead to partisan turnout, that's a turnout problem. We have laws for this. And that's why that's why you see Iowa and Georgia right now passing laws against voter turnout and the reasons that people do turn out. If you want to have a turnout debate, we should talk about turnout, not using the first process of term limits to then trickle down into turnout elections. And then a more informed electorate. Again, that's a trickle down thing that I think we're not even close to seeing the effects of. If you want members talking to your voters, then make sure that they come and talk to your voters. And if they don't, then they lose your support. But if you want to talk about civic engagement and civic knowledge, we should actually have some courses, some training, some investment on civic engagement in this country, where most of these folks on this call, I'm sure, took some sort of civics class, where in less than 10% of high schools across the country, it is now one semester of American history or government, which has very little to do with actual civics and the ability to read about it and to know what you're voting on and the effects of all of these things. So these are, again, all different discussions that all get looped into the great benefits of term limits that we just don't ever see play out.
Scott, did you have anything to add? Because I was going to go to Mark for another question.
I do have something to add to that. So we know we have states that have term limits. Michigan has very strict term limits, the best in the country. We have California, Arkansas, Florida, lots of places. A guy named Randy Holcomb did a study and found that states with term limits, their budgets grow. I know we'd all love to see government slashed and balanced budgets, but the fact of the matter is when you look at state budgets and changes, you want to look at how fast they're growing. And in states with term limits, there is a noticeable, they're growing a lot slower than in states without term limits. And you can look up Mr. Holcomb's studies. Anybody can email me and I would be glad to get that information over to him. The other thing we know is, I mean, Yeah, Congress isn't getting rich from campaign donations, but they're getting rich from something. Their families are getting rich. They're getting rich. You know, there is some stuff going on there. So to claim that, you know,
Can I ask how they're getting rich? Like literally how that process happens? How are
literally
they?
how that process happens, there's cronyism issues, and you have guys who, you know, these nerds who work in the agencies like Ivanka Trump and Hunter Biden, who are just nerds, and they're, you know, getting positions on boards and chairmanship because of, you know, they're nerds. No, they're getting positions on boards and chairmanships and as lobbyists because they are connected. And that's how it works. And companies that are connected are getting all kinds of things stuffed into the stimulus bill. They're getting all kinds of things stuffed into these large omnibus bills that pass, which is the only way we seem to pass legislation now. Nothing comes out that's small and to the point. This is how they're getting rich. Their friends, their cronies are getting rich. Their relations are getting rich. And, you know, we have different laws that are written to stop cronyism and to stop nepotism and things like that. And they're writing the laws, they make the rules, and they find ways around it. I mean, there's a good reason why everybody is frustrated that the people who end up in Washington tend to be millionaires, and they tend to get a lot more rich when they're there.
So Mark, it seems like the bureaucrats are making the decision with or without term limits. And so I kind of want you to take some time and talk to us a little bit about Convention of States approach to solving this problem and bringing it back to the states, and how that could maybe be another solution. Because one of the questions we did get was, if, you know, term limits isn't the final answer, then what is the path forward? Where do we look? So I think you can shed some light on that.
Yeah, I mean, so again, I believe in a broader vision of term limits. I just think term limits without term limits on the staffers and the bureaucrats is really dangerous. I just don't think it's a solution. And I believe in a broader solution, which is I think that we have to act as citizens in the states to take the power away from Washington, D.C. and give it back to the people in the states. And what I'm talking about when I'm talking about this is not, it's not changing the Constitution. It's actually a restoration of the Constitution. This is what I'm discussing, our original system of federalism. And I think it's particularly relevant in this day and age. We live in a time when there is a lot of hatred among our people, a lot of dislike state to state, city to country, region to region. The country's divided 50-50, and it's getting worse. It's getting worse every day. I think we're experiencing what I call very often the great decoupling. People on one side of the aisle going one direction, commercially, socially, culturally, and people on the other side going the other way. And the question is, can we hold the country together? I think that's a fundamental question right now. And the answer is, I think we can if we return to our roots, and our roots are federalism. It's important that we remember where we come from. We have a fantasy, I think, about the founding of this country. And the fantasy goes something like this, that these 13 colonies totally unified, linked arms, fought against King George, beat the bad King George, and came back totally unified and loving and formed this incredible country called the United States. The reality is the colonies hated each other. There was incredible division. It was mostly sectarian Christianity. They called each other blasphemers. How much did they hate each other in 1787 as they went to convention to form the new Constitution? There was a trade war about to go to blows, literally, between New York and New Jersey. So we've always disliked each other. We disliked each other so much in the 1860s, we had a civil war. We forced a union on the country. It was important to force that union on the country, but it was out of our dislike for each other, our different cultures, our different beliefs, fundamental beliefs, right? We stayed together, but the truth is this country is still very different. California is very different than Texas. Texas is very different than Iowa, than New Jersey. And to acknowledge that is to say that if we want to stay together, we stay together in a federalist system. And what does that mean? It's a system where the power isn't centralized, because when the power is in DC, if you have a Biden administration and a Democrat Congress, then Republicans and conservatives are really upset all the time. If you have a Trump administration and Republicans in Congress, then the left and Democrats are upset all the time. What we ought to do, and what Convention of States is all about, is taking the power away from the federal government, giving it back to the states, and let them be governmentally and culturally different within a federalist system. That was a system that was designed for people who didn't really like each other, didn't get along that well, but understood for a broader purpose, they needed to be united under a federal umbrella. And that's the purpose of the Convention of States project.
Awesome. We talked a bit about term limiting staffers and, you know, bureaucrats and things like that. Has that been done? Maybe Scott knows the answer. Well, anybody, feel free to jump in. Has that been done? And if it has, what does it look like? If it hasn't, what would it look like? Would it just be simply, well, not simply, but passing legislation the same way that you would look at doing so for elected officials, or what does that look like?
So it has not been done as a restriction on employment yet, but we can look and see what has happened in a few different places where we have term limits and how that has changed the situation. So in Michigan, when new people are elected, they tend to bring people with them from their campaigns or from outside, as well as hiring a lot of new people, and we get a lot of new people hired. In Washington, D.C., oftentimes when a new person is hired, they'll import staff from other offices and from other people in there because of that institutional knowledge thing. Now, one thing that has been brought up in the conversation here is this idea that, there's all this knowledge in DC, and if we have new people coming in, they're not going to have access to that knowledge. Well, that's actually a benefit of term limits. The idea that you're a representative, maybe rather than going to the experts in DC to look for answers, those representatives who have big personal networks of their own are going to go and get more advice from their community and from their district, which is how our government should be run, of the people. And the idea that, they don't have an expertise on this, I mean, look at where the country is going right now. We've got more and more debt, and we've got more and more problems that we've had in the past because we keep falling back to these same solutions and these same government experts, because the people who are in power, the committee chairs and the other people who are in leadership there, go to those people, when really we need some outside of DC experience to get in there. And right now, when the outside of DC representatives get there, they're stuck in positions where they don't have voices for over a decade, at which point now they've built the relationships with the people who are doing it the way it's always been done. We can't expect changes when you keep forcing people into a system and then don't give them any say until they've been there long enough to get to go native.
If Casey or Mark wanted to jump in, if not, I can ask Casey the next question I had planned.
No, I'll just say that this is exactly the point, right? Like you can make great waves in Congress, but the fact is you are only representing your district, which is exactly how it's supposed to vote. You are one vote of 435 or one of 100. And so when you say that the Tea Party didn't have the effects that it wanted, or people are frustrated with the Occupy Wall Street because it didn't have the effects that it wanted, it didn't have enough votes. And they didn't represent enough districts and enough voters to actually change outcomes because they got voted down. If I know anything about Congress, and I think that I do, is that leaders are only as powerful as their members allow them to be. That if there are enough votes, they will put things on the floor and things will pass. And if there are overwhelmingly enough votes for this to happen, then they will take over the process to the point of the Tea Party's deposing 2 speakers of the House within 4 years. And these are the things that actually matter when they have friends and they have enough votes to do it. And when they agree on the issue, and this is another misconception about DC, as much disagreement that there are between 2 parties, there is more disagreement within the 2 parties, which keeps things off the floor, which again goes back to the process arguments. I am fully on board with more people having more say outside of committee chairs and committee and party leaders. We should have more opportunities to affect legislation, which means more votes, even if it means voting things down. But that's a different process where if you throw in freshman members all of the time, that it's just going to more empower those committee chairs. It's going to more empower those party leaders because people are going to be moving in and out all at the same time, which leads to a final point, and then I'll shut up, is that if we think this is going to have any effect on polarization, it's going to exacerbate it. The reality is over 85% of the seats in this country are not competitive. Whether they're gerrymandered, whether they are majority minority, whether they're purposefully drawn this way, there's some of that to be sure, too much of it to be sure. But at the same time, we've concentrated, we've sorted geographically, we've sorted ideologically. And if we think that having term limits that kick these people out over and over, which means you get more diverse candidates, the reality is you're just going to exacerbate politicians because you're going to have to win the primary. All that matters in 85% of these elections are the primaries. Then you're going to win the general. And so to win those primaries, where 20% of the electorate actually turns out, you go to the extremes of your party, which then you go to the DC and you represent the extremes. And that's how we get these non-conversationals and how we get these party drawn lines where there's no opportunity for consensus. Because the quickest way to lose your seat in most of these districts is to compromise, not to actually get something done.
So I guess, Casey, the question I want to ask is, so what do you see as the solution to some of the issues that we brought up today? that your counterparts, if you will, think, or maybe Mark is kind of in the middle here, think that term limits will solve? What do you see as some of the solutions from your experience and just from your, I guess, research and whatever you think?
Yeah, so there's about 100 different solutions, which is why this is so frustrating. And if it depends on what problem you're actually trying to solve. If it's not having a say in DC and you're pissed about money in politics, let's take on money in politics. If you want to have a constitutional amendment or a convention be drawn, I bet that one will pull pretty well too. If you want to talk about the people that run and the fact that they're all millionaires, get more access, open access to the ballot, not only for candidates themselves, but put folks to actually choose these things. If you're pissed about only parties showing up for their primaries to select the most extreme candidates, open them up, making them more accessible to the every man and woman to know that they are. Don't make it on a Tuesday in the middle of November. I offer all of these things up. It depends what you're mad about. There are processes and studies and research and expert opinions to say that we can solve some of these things. But at the fundamental level, and I think we can all agree on this, is that it's going to take people that have power now giving up some of that power. That's going to come from the bottom up. It always has, and it always will, that it will be a frustration felt by all of the people with a common purpose behind their change that they want, and an ability to talk to each other and recognize that you're not the enemy, that we are all in this together. And even though we come at our policies from different perspectives, what we can agree on is that we should open up this process and make sure that that electoral accountability thread is as strong as possible.
I'd like to, if you could just enlighten us about what's going on there. We've obviously heard a lot about it in the news as of late, and we did just have a luncheon on big tech, so we can just say this is a brief extension of that. So if you could just talk about that for a minute, I think everybody would enjoy hearing about that.
Yeah, I'd be happy to do that. Look, I came to help Parler because I believe it's an existential fight. What we have is a purely partisan political attack against a free speech platform that had attracted a lot of people on the right. To be clear, Parler is not a right-wing platform. It is a free speech platform for everybody. And by free speech, I need to define that, because I think all the tech giants would say they're in favor of free speech. They're lying, of course, because they censor speech regularly. Parler says, we say at Parler, that if it's legal, then you can say it on Parler. That's the First Amendment standard. And that means, by the way, that you could potentially see things on Parler that you would find really offensive. I've seen a bunch of them. Parler also believes in a corollary to the First Amendment, which is you can say it, but it doesn't mean I have to listen to it. And so Parler has what we call an automatic troll filter. The really bad content, you're not going to see it on your feed. There's going to be a filter that pops up in front of it unless you choose to release that filter. Parler is also your feed, your way. And what that means is we don't believe in the evil algorithm. See, an algorithm is used to manipulate you. It puts things in your feed that you didn't ask to be in your feed. On Parler, if you go to Parler and you were to open up your Parler account and you were not to follow anybody, you would see in your feed precisely nothing, literally nothing. You only get what you sign up for. So mostly, even if there's bad content, you're not going to see it because you're not signing up for stuff like that. And you can filter it in case comments came into your feed that were like that. So free speech is the primary value. Data sovereignty is the secondary value. It's equal, but I just say it second. And what I mean by data sovereignty is you own your own data. We don't see the person who is a user of Parler as a commodity. We don't own your data. We don't monetize your data. We don't use your data. You own that data, and only you own that data. So this is a twofer, by the way, why the tech oligarchs hate us. They hate free speech, number one, because if you're not going to speak into the woke left mold, then you're going to be canceled. And number two, they hate our model because we're proving that you can have a financial model that's moral and ethical and isn't based on essentially what I think is consumer fraud in the way they monetize consumer data. And you can still succeed. And it's a very dangerous model to the tech oligarchs. They really hate it. So they came after us for those two reasons. The third premise of Parler is just civil dialogue, civil discourse. The word is actually parler. It's a French word, and it means to lay down your arms. People are in conflict, lay down arms and come and have a conversation. That's actually the point of Parler. And the reason it became so big on the right is just because there was so much censorship on the left. And I want to dispel one last thing, which really frustrates me, this idea that somehow Parler had something to do with the events on January 6th at the Capitol. The numbers are in. The research has been done. It's not me, it's Forbes and others. They've done an independent research. The vast, huge, gigantic majority of any untoward activity that was taking place on or before January 6th in regard to the events of the Capitol took place on Facebook. And Sheryl Sandberg had the audacity to go out in the media and point at Parler. There have been over 240 charging documents of people who were engaged in that in some way that have been charged with something. There are over 70 of them on Facebook. There are another 30 or 40 on Instagram and on Twitter and on all these platforms on YouTube. There's only, I believe, 6 of them on Parler. So Parler's folks, the community on Parler was uninvolved. We have and had always had good moderation in regard to making people live up to our community standards. We're back, we're online, we're independent of big tech. I'm proud to say we built a stack that's completely independent of big tech. And one last thing I want to say, this is important. If you're a donor or you support conservative organizations, you better make sure that those organizations are not on AWS. They're not on Amazon Web Services. They're not vulnerable to these other tech providers. It's not a matter of if they're going to be canceled. It's a matter of when they're going to be canceled. And I have folks that can provide those services for you. If you know people who might be vulnerable, you can write to me at markmeckler@protonmail.com.
Awesome. Thank you. Well, with that, I want to give everybody a chance to kind of wrap up and give us your final thoughts, and just let us know how you're feeling and where people can find your work, and if there's anything new that you guys are working on that you want us to be aware of. Since Mark just spoke, you get a chance to speak again, but since Mark just spoke, if Casey or Scott want to go first, that'd be great.
Go ahead, Casey.
No, this is a great conversation. It's something that I wish more people talked more about, to talk about the pros and cons of something like this and the magnitude of this. We need some reset buttons, to be sure, across a whole host of issues: internal, external, political, societal, communications wise. We really need to get back to basics on a lot of these issues, but it's important to have honest conversations about what are likely to be the effects of this. And folks that do this for a living, that study this, that have seen this, are coming down almost universally against it. It does more harm than good. So let's attack the problems that we know, can agree that exist, attack them very, very directly, and not hopes that the second or third order effects of these things will trickle down to fix a lot of the problems that we agree that we do have. We need 2 parties in this system. Unless we have multiple, we need 2 strong parties that treat each other with some sort of mutual toleration, if not a full-on respect. And we've gotten a little bit away from that. This isn't the first time this has happened. Politics, like history itself, is cyclical, and I'm confident that we can come back from a lot of what ails us right now. And it starts with conversations like these. So kudos to you guys for putting something like this on, where you guys meet and talk about issues of the day. It's incredibly important to rebuild these civic engagements, not only with our politics, but with each other. And so I really appreciate the time for this today. And other than that, you don't want to find my work. It's way too boring. And I'll be back anytime that you guys want to talk about anything relating to anything that has to do with the success of the United States.
Thank you. Appreciate it.
So you can find us online, US Term Limits, termlimits.com. And anything that I spoke about today that you have interest in, feel free to shoot me an email. I'm sure Charles has my email, and you can just ask and they'll provide it. Term limits, they're not a panacea, a silver bullet that's going to solve every problem, but they do increase the fairness of our elections by taking away incumbent advantage. They do break up legislator lobbyist relationships, legislator bureaucrat relationships, and they leave legislators more connected to their district. And if we're going to be a nation that is governed of the people, then we need legislators that are connected to their districts, not legislators that go away and become connected to special interests and, essentially lock other people out of the process with incumbent advantage. And that's what we're pursuing at all levels of government: term limits. And it will improve things. You can look at, we have several states now that have term limits. As much as the lobbyists there would like to tell you that every single problem in the state is the fault of term limits, they're not. Every state has similar problems. Term limit states have problems just like other states. We have corruption. The difference with term limit states is our corruption gets found out very quickly because nobody is depending on the legislator to have their job long term. And over time, the legislators become much more responsive to the people, and it takes much less of a machine to win those seats. So term limits are very effective, and they're the only thing that can be done to combat incumbent advantage without layering on different laws that would essentially be, incumbents making laws to try to make fair elections. Term limits do equal that playing field. So you can find us on termlimits.com and check out any of our media and materials there.
Thank you. And Mark, all you.
So as the guy who sort of comes down the middle here, I'll try to be the deciding vote. How's that? It's a good place to be. And oddly, I would say I probably come down more with Casey on this one. And we probably disagree on a lot of stuff politically. I think trying to see term limits as a panacea, a standalone thing, I think it's really dangerous. And I may be in favor of term limits with a package of other reforms. I think Casey is hitting something, a more appropriate theme, which is you can't just pick this one thing and expect it's going to solve a bunch of stuff, because it's not, and it's going to create problems at the second and third order. And so again, if I'm in favor of term limits, I'm going to say I, first of all, at a minimum, need term limits on legislators, bureaucrats, and staffers as well, so that we've got full institutional churn going on. We don't empower one of those groups of people that we don't intend to empower. And I think there are a lot more things we have to fix as well. And this is, again, why Casey and I probably in a general sense believe there's a lot more that needs to be done in the system than a single issue thing like term limits. So for me, it's a broader pitch. It's going after the federal government more generally, taking power away from centralized government and giving it back to the people. I would say the same thing in the States. Huge fan of taking power away from centralized government, and giving it back to the people. One last thing, if term limits works and if they really make places better, I'm not sure why I had to leave California and move to Texas. So you can find my work at conventionofstates.com. You can follow us there. We're active in 21 legislatures around the country this year. I expect to pass 5 or 6 more right now pending, and really active in Wisconsin, Wyoming, West Virginia, North Carolina, South Carolina, Ohio, Pennsylvania, and Michigan. And one last thing, by the way, because of term limits in Michigan, we just lost the single best state legislator in the United States that I've ever met. And that's Lee Chatfield, who was forced to retire as Speaker of the House in Michigan.